Hi there, everybody. I want to welcome you to the third event of our week-long commemoration of the Constitution, constitutionalism, and American civic culture. I'm Steve Balch, the director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, which is sponsoring these events. And the whole idea here is to try to build a set of perspectives from the point of view of different disciplines on this great theme of free government, and particularly of our own free government. So we've had, this is the third, we've had 3 lectures so far. We started off with a lecture on the biblical roots of the thinking of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and that was given by Ryan Hockenbrock of the English department. We went on to a musical lecture about the tunes that made the American Revolution, given by Stacy Jacoy of the music school, who's back there now. And today, having gone from jollity and dance, we're going to go to postmortems, which I guess is a somewhat stiff subject, but it will be brought alive by our speaker, historian Erin Legacey. So, let me now turn things over to our lecturer of the day, who really has a very fascinating subject that she once told me about over lunch, I believe. So, please, Erin Legacey.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for coming. Can you hear me, Katie? Yep, okay, great. All right, so I guess I'll just jump into it. Well, a lot of the talks we've been hearing as part of the speaker series have referenced the founding fathers of the American Revolution. On Monday, and we already heard about this a little bit, but on Monday we heard about their relationship to Locke, liberalism, and the Bible. And yesterday we saw them singing in not one but 2 Broadway musicals. And I have no doubt this train will continue during tomorrow's and Monday's talks. But to be honest, I'm like a bit of an outsider to this whole thing, to this American popular political culture, and the historical celebrity of founders is always a little bit foreign to me. I'm Canadian, and I know the names of like Canada's first prime minister. It's John A. Macdonald, but there's no real like mythology there, right? No one's like John A. Macdonald. I celebrate Canada Day on July 1st, but I can't really tell you a scintillating and dramatic tale about the British North America Act of 1867. Some people probably could, I can't. And so maybe it's because of the sort of lack of high drama and excitement in Canadian history that I was drawn very early on in my academic career to what I think is like the most hyperbolic and audacious event in modern history, the French Revolution. And this is like a period in history that still surprises, delights, and horrifies me in equal measure. But the French Revolution doesn't really have any founding fathers either. It has famous figures. In Monday's talk, Dr. Hockenbrock referred to Robespierre's reign of terror, and he's not here today, so I'm not going to like give him a hard time for that. Robespierre gets a bad rap. But neither Robespierre nor any of his colleagues would have thought of themselves as fathers or as founders of the revolution. This was really important to them. No one in revolutionary France would dare to invoke this kind of patriarchal metaphor. In 1789, when the French Revolution begins, France had a father, right? A father who thought he ruled them by divine right. Talking about the king, right? One of the first things I teach my students of the French Revolution, a couple of whom are here today, so they already know this, is that at its most basic, the French Revolution is about toppling that patriarchy, that hierarchy, and replacing it with the horizontal society of equals, of brothers, not of sort of fathers.
Is that when the term citizen comes into being, or did citizen exist before?
The word citizen?
Yes.
Yeah, no, it doesn't come into...
Constitutional case citizen Genet, for example.
Oh, do you mean using citizen as an address instead of monsieur or madame?
A fellow French.
Absolutely, citizen or citizeness. Yeah, exactly. This is when instead of the more formal. And similarly, instead of referring to people as vous, the polite form of you, you'd refer them as tu during the Revolution. Yeah, yes. So where was I? Yes. Sort of this toppling of the patriarchy, the toppling of the hierarchy, replacing with a horizontal society of equals of brothers. And this is the founding myth of the French Revolution, right? So instead of these larger-than-life fathers, we have what Lynn Hunt, one of the foremost historians of the French Revolution, also previously the president of the American Historical Association, referred to as a band of brothers, which is drawing on myth. And this is, of course, the fraternity in liberty, equality, fraternity, the term that I think gets like least attention, but the one that's sort of a distinctively French innovation in this situation, this famous motto of the French Revolution. So one really good place to find this story repeated is in one of the first popular histories of the French Revolution, which was published in 1848 by Jules Michelet. This is a great portrait of Michelet. And he's famous for a lot of things, but one of the things he's most famous for, especially among historians, is being the first person, the first professional historian to write the history of France, history of his nation, from the archives. So he was director of the archives, and he sort of wrote the history by digging into primary sources, which is, of course, what we all do now, but he was the first person in France to do this. Michelet began his 8-volume history of the French Revolution by lamenting the fact that the revolution had left no monuments in its wake. He says, "The empire has its column and engrosses almost exclusively the Arc of Triumph. Royalty has its Louvre, its hospital of invalids. The feudal church of the 12th century is still enthroned at Notre Dame. Nay, the very Romans have their imperial ruins. And the revolution has for her monument empty space." And so here what he's referring to is the Champ de Mars, this open plain along the Seine where the Eiffel Tower now stands, but wouldn't until the end of the 19th century, which was where many important festivals during the Revolution took place. And I'll come back to this in a little bit because it's an important space in revolutionary Paris. And then immediately after commenting on the lack of the revolutions, or the revolution's lack of monuments, Michelet moves on to discuss its heroes. And he's explicitly not talking about Napoleon. He says, "No, there is one here greater even than him, more powerful and more immortal." And he's certainly not talking about Robespierre or any single individual. He's referring specifically to the people. He also writes a book called The People around the same time period. The people, or the nation, or if we want to keep using this language of fatherhood going, la patrie, the fatherland, as a collective. So, but despite this kind of deep-seated resistance to the notion of individual as special paternal authority, the revolutionaries in France were deeply invested in this idea of founding, right? Of founding the revolution. If you tear down an old regime, if you cut off its head, I mean that, literally, you need something new to anchor your new regime and to keep it in place. And when we talk about the political culture of the French Revolution, almost everything feels like a significant act of foundation or of founding, whether it's something destructive, like getting rid of a king, or a more conventional constructive act, like writing a constitution, or if you're a French revolutionary, 3 constitutions. But one of the things I'm going to try to articulate today is that some of the most memorable materials that revolutionaries used to fashion the foundation for their new revolution were their dead, both heroes and villains. And this might be the closest thing we get to founders in the French Revolution. But to go back to Michelet for a moment, there actually was a pretty significant monument to the French Revolution in Paris in 1848 when he was writing. It's still there, the French Pantheon, which occupies a pretty significant and visible space right in the middle of the Latin Quarter, not far from the Sorbonne, kind of across the street from Luxembourg Gardens. You really can't miss it. Here's a contemporary image. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Pantheon is exactly what it sounds like. It's a temple to the great men, and more recently, a very small number of women, of modern France. It was invented by revolutionaries who populated it very sparsely with their dead heroes, but not just as a way to honor their heroes, that's certainly a big part of it, but to co-opt and control the meanings of their lives after death. So I'm going to start the story a couple years into the revolution, in the spring of 1791. So here are the highlights of what's happened so far in the spring of 1791. France has transformed from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. The elected legislature holds almost all of the power at this point. The legislature is unicameral because following revolutionary logic, the nation, la patrie, cannot and should not be divided. And its constitutional committee is almost finished writing the first French constitution. Now, one of the first major events of the French Revolution, even before the sort of famous storming of the Bastille, involved this impromptu oath in which elected representatives from throughout France swear together and sort of one at a time sign their name to this document, promising to remain united until they give France a constitution, until they write France a constitution. This is the famous tennis court oath that takes place, even as I said before, the storming of the Bastille. And by the spring of 1791, they're almost finished. It's taken 2 years of negotiations and compromises to produce, and it's a shining example of moderation. It's an attempt to build a constitutional monarchy with a very weak monarch in France. It makes much of ideals like popular sovereignty and equality under the law, but in fact it does divide the population very rigidly between active and passive citizens, and only active citizens, that is sort of property-holding men of a certain age, are allowed to vote or hold office. But by the spring of 1791, again, we're 2 years into the revolution, it's going relatively well. There are divisions that are starting to show, but there haven't been any major disruptions other than like the revolution itself. The main goal of the revolutionaries is to build a new France in line with these revolutionary principles of liberty, equality, fraternity, justice, equality under the law. And at this moment, one of the most well-known legislators of the revolution, Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, le Comte de Mirabeau, or Mirabeau, as he's more commonly known, becomes gravely ill. So Mirabeau, this is him right here, in this famous drawing by Jacques-Louis David, like the painter of the Revolution. Mirabeau's over here, kind of looking up to the sky. So Mirabeau becomes gravely ill, and he had been famous, or perhaps infamous, since before the Revolution. One historian recently referred to him as a one-man cause célèbre. He was, as his title indicates, a member of the nobility, but by the time the Revolution breaks out, he's very much a disgraced member of the nobility. He's known for his various scandals and love affairs, one of which lands him in prison as a young man thanks to a lettre de cachet from his father. This is one of the notorious features of the old regime judicial system, where a member of the nobility could write a letter to the king requesting that you be imprisoned without trial and sort of held detained in prison for X amount of time. And Mirabeau's father requests that he's put in prison for this love affair. Actually, he's going to be imprisoned by lettre de cachet 2 more times in his life, in 1774 and 1777. First for fighting with another member of the nobility, and second for running away with a married woman. Less scandalously, though, he becomes known for his political writings in the pre-revolutionary period, which included, fittingly, a powerful essay about the unjust nature of these lettres de cachet. So it should come as no surprise, then, that despite his official status as a member of the nobility, Mirabeau enthusiastically embraces the revolutionary project as soon as it begins. He's actually elected to the first French legislature as a member of the Third Estate, or the common people, not a member of the nobility. And Mirabeau really came into his own during the early revolution, where he was an energetic and larger-than-life presence in the legislature. So recent historians have written about Mirabeau and described him as the first colossus of the revolution. He was the first great political man of the revolution, someone else wrote, and someone else wrote, no other individual came closer to exercising true charisma within the assembly. The assembly is the name of the legislature. So in terms of his politics, Mirabeau is a resolute moderate and an energetic supporter of constitutional monarchy. He's a great admirer of British constitutionalism, and for all these reasons, he's a great embodiment of the early French Revolution. And then in 1791, Mirabeau becomes ill with a heart condition. But this is kind of kept under wraps. And news of his illness is not made public until he's very, very sick and on the verge of death at the end of March. And so on the 29th of March, 1791, the news breaks that Mirabeau is ill. And this becomes a truly national affair. People flock to his house I think he lives on the Rue Saint-Honoré, and people are swarming the streets, trying to sort of get information about Mirabeau, or possibly come and see him and bid him farewell. And there are informational bulletins that the state puts out several times a day, just updating people, like on Mirabeau's condition, how he's deteriorating slowly, or quickly, rather, not slowly. And he dies quickly at home, surrounded by people on April 2nd, so within a couple of days of the announcement being made. And one recent historian has described Mirabeau's death as almost too good to be true, almost as though he had planned this good death for himself. But despite this elegant passing, see, this is a contemporary image of the death of Mirabeau, and I believe this is probably France who sort of got her hand on him, perhaps, guiding him. And then this feels pretty obviously to be like the old regime with the shackles, who's sort of watching him in the distance. But I could be reading that wrong, and if anyone has a different interpretation, I'd love to hear it during the Q&A portion. Michelet dies, and despite the sort of elegance of his death, rumors immediately begin circulating about the cause of his death. To a lot of people, he seemed perfectly fine up until people said he was dead. He wasn't, of course. He'd been sick for months, but this was sort of kept secret. And people wanted explanations. And very quickly, and this is like within hours of his death, people start claiming that Mirabeau had been poisoned, right? Had been poisoned by royalists, by counter-revolutionaries. And royalists, for their part, suggest that Mirabeau may have died as a result of his debauched lifestyle, right? So maybe he died of some sort of sexually contracted disease. And so all of this misinformation makes for a very, very unstable situation. So the revolutionaries turn to science for answers. And they order a very well-publicized autopsy of Mirabeau. And there are 27 doctors and 30 official witnesses who are taking part in this autopsy, in this postmortem. And they do confirm very quickly that he did in fact die of natural causes. Like, phew, right? If he'd been poisoned, or he died of sort of a disgraceful disease, like, heaven knows what would have happened. But once the issue of Mirabeau's death is settled, the state needs to figure out what to do with him, and fast. Now, Mirabeau had requested before his death that his remains be transported to a nearby suburban community of Argenteuil, where his family is, where he could be kept, buried with his ancestors. But contrary to his wishes, there is kind of an immediate and widespread demand to keep him in the capital. And I think this is where things start to get interesting. And conversations about what to do with Mirabeau after his death reveal a lot about how revolutionaries were thinking about the relationship between the nation and its first dead hero. And as the renowned architect Antoine Laurent Thomas Vaudreuil argued in the immediate wake of Mirabeau's death, Mirabeau's love of family was admirable, right? Of course, it makes sense he wants to be buried with his ancestors. But when it comes down to it, he was a man of the patrie, and as such, he belonged to the nation. And the state sort of owed Mirabeau special honors after death, but more to the point, the state had an opportunity, perhaps even an obligation, to commemorate and display Mirabeau's remains in the most useful way possible. But there's no immediate consensus about what this might look like. For his part, Vaudreuil feels very strongly that the best place to bury Mirabeau would be in one of Paris's most illustrious and well-traveled streets, the Champs-Élysées, which he thought might make for a nice open-air cemetery for France's dead heroes. Anyone who's been to Paris probably knows the Champs-Élysées. It's where like the Louis Vuitton store is, right? It's this big wide boulevard that leads from the Arc de Triomphe all the way to the Louvre. I've got an image of it here from 1789. Looks a little bit different back then. So Vaudreuil imagines this already illustrious boulevard becoming even more impressive if it's lined on both sides, not just with trees, but with simple allegorical monuments and the buried remains of the Revolution's greatest and most virtuous citizens, the first of whom would be Mirabeau. But he also wanted to include a couple of those whose deaths had preceded the Revolution pretty substantially, specifically Voltaire and Rousseau, both of whom would have to be disinterred and sort of moved from their existing graves and transported to this open-air cemetery. Now, burying the inspiring dead on a well-traveled street, he argued, would guarantee that France's great men would be visited daily by, quote, 1,000 Frenchmen and just as many foreigners, who would spill their tears and return home committed to imitating the virtues and good behavior of the dead, right? This kind of emulation. He further imagined fathers with their sons and tutors with their students kind of walking down this honor way, as he called it, sharing valuable lessons, learning about the lives of the dead. This isn't what ends up happening, but this is the proposal. Now, a similar plan is proposed by a delegation of Parisians representing various neighborhoods of the capital who present themselves in a petition before the legislature on the morning of April 3rd, so the day after Mirabeau's death. They kind of show up with this idea, this request of the state. They appeal to their elected representatives to first, number one, declare an official week of mourning for Mirabeau, and second, to bury him not on the Champs-Élysées, they don't know about this proposal, but to bury him on the Champ de la Fédération, which is the Champ de Mars, underneath an altar to the fatherland. Okay, so this is the space that Michelet referred to early in my talk as like the only monument to the revolution. So this is a significant space to revolutionaries because a year earlier, on the one-year anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, so July 14, 1790, there had been this massive, massive festival that took place commemorating the one-year anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, but it culminated in this oath where members of the citizens' militia, which is this military that's loyal to the revolution, not to the king, all swear an oath of loyalty to defend the nation. And they're joined by all these civilians. And this festival, and so it's taken at this exact same time everyone takes this oath of loyalty. You can see here's the altar to the fatherland in the middle of the Champ de la Fédération. And this is replicated all over the country. And so all across France, allegedly at the same time, people are swearing this oath of loyalty to the nation. So it's this, again, great sort of foundational moment in the early revolution. And so this delegation of like ordinary Parisians is proposing that Mirabeau be buried right here under this altar to the fatherland. And it makes sense for them to like sort of further sacralize this space with the dead body, right, of one of their greatest orators. And the group justifies their request by noting that previously, before the revolution, any kind of official mourning period or state funeral would have been reserved exclusively for the king. But in the era of the revolution, the nation owed it to a virtuous man like Mirabeau, who had, quote, had the courage to break the chains of despotism and establish the foundations for a constitution that would ultimately lead to the glory and happiness of the French nation. Now, so they show up at the legislature and they present this petition. And then immediately after, if you're reading sort of the records of the debates and the conversations that are taking place, an official representative of the city of Paris, Monsieur Pastoret, or Citizen Pastoret, presents a proposal on behalf of the city, a competing proposal. To this idea of putting him on the Champ de Mars. And after noting that not just France, but the entire universe was in mourning for the loss of Mirabeau, Pastoret exhorted his colleagues not to let their tears be in vain, right? Everyone is mourning, let's make this productive. And for inspiration of what to do in this particular situation, Pastoret did as many 18th century Frenchmen did, he looked to antiquity. Many ancient populations, he explained, have enclosed their beloved heroes in specially designated buildings. Creating a kind of repository for the dead, for dead heroes, he explained, would lead to a kind of cult of the dead, which would in turn become a great benefit to the nation by converting the tomb of a great man like Mirabeau into its own altar of liberty. So not this one, but its own. Pastoret then presented a motion before the legislature proposing that one of France's newest and like not really used buildings, the Church of Sainte-Geneviève, or Sainte-Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris, be converted into a temple for the remains of great men, quote, from the era of our liberty. So not like great men generally, great men of the revolutionary era. And that Mirabeau's would be the inaugural corpse in this new space. And he also suggested that at a future date, maybe Descartes and Voltaire and Rousseau would be kind of brought in to join Mirabeau. And finally, Pastoret recommended that the new temple should prominently display the phrase to great men, the grateful fatherland, right? Here it is. Au grand homme, la patrie reconnaissante. So like, to great men, like the fatherland thanks you or recognizes you. Several members of the National Assembly weigh in on this proposal, including Maximilien Robespierre, who wholeheartedly supports the motion and further stresses the importance of this august project. It wasn't simply a question of honoring one particular great man. He's like, yes, let's definitely honor Mirabeau, but of rewarding the great men of France, a process he passionately believed would, quote, act as the seed of patriotism and would sow all the virtues, these are his words, necessary for the new nation to blossom and thrive. Indeed, Robespierre thought that this notion of the French Pantheon was so important and so central to the founding of the new state, the new nation, that it needed to be discussed actually by the committee writing the Constitution. And so this idea of the French Pantheon immediately takes root and blossoms in the Assembly, and it's decreed, fine, this is what we're going to do. And this is all happening in like a matter of hours, right? It's a very, very hasty, very quick decision. And the next evening, so April 4, Mirabeau's body is transported with this like unprecedented amount of pomp and circumstance to the church of Sainte-Geneviève, rechristened as the French Pantheon. There are 60 battalions of cavalry and infantry. There are 60 battalions of National Guardsmen that march by. They're followed by this huge assortment of ecclesiastics and officials, and then there's this urn bearing Mirabeau's heart that follows behind them, and then a coffin with his body that's draped in the tricolore, the flag, and a wreath. Then a bunch of delegations from various political clubs and societies follow behind that. And the whole procession marches through the city in the evening, and then speeches take place, and at midnight he is brought to this new Pantheon, the Church of Sainte-Geneviève. As many as 400,000 people show up to this funeral, so it's this really massive event. And many people reflect on the fact that this funeral rivaled and perhaps even exceeded the old regime's morning festivities. The national newspaper reported that Bourbon ceremonial had never matched the splendor, right? The revolution is even more impressive. Here's another great image from the same time period of a father showing his son the tomb of Mirabeau in the sort of basement of the Pantheon. So Mirabeau was very notably the first, but not the last dead individual entombed in this French temple to great men during the Revolutionary era. Several months later, in July of 1791, the decomposing remains of Voltaire were exhumed from their rural resting place of 13 years and transported, also with much celebration, to the Pantheon. And the story of Voltaire's pantheonization is really quite interesting, and I'm happy to talk more about it if you want, but I've just sort of gone through the details of Mirabeau, so I want to move on. I'd like to skip forward 2 more years to the next phase of the revolution, the summer of 1793. So if the first 2 years of the revolution can be characterized as fairly liberal and fairly moderate, the next 2, from 1792 to 1794, are where things start to get a lot more radical. And so summer 1793 puts us right in the middle of this phase. By this point, the royal family's been arrested. The king is dead. He's lost his head. He's been executed for conspiring against the revolution. France is now a republic, not a constitutional monarchy. And obviously then it has a new constitution, right? You can't have a constitutional monarchy without a monarch. And so this new constitution of 1793 has been written. France is also at war with major European powers, including Austria, Prussia, Spain, and Great Britain. And France is embroiled in a civil war between proponents and opponents of the revolution. This is also when the guillotine is being used against people convicted of political crimes. It's generally referred to as the Terror, this period in France. And also throughout 1793, there's this sustained and energetic attempt to erase all references to the old regime, to the past, to the monarchy and church in particular. So this means all signs of feudalism are removed from public. So statues, portraits, things like that. Street names are changed, and even a new 10-month calendar is invented, complete with a new decimal clock. Now, if you recall, at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the father of France is always the king. Well, the revolutionaries killed their father, right, in January of 1793, but they weren't content to stop with him. Shortly after Louis's execution, the journalist and publisher Louis Prudhomme wrote about France's other kings, so before Louis XVI, in his newspaper La Révolution de Paris. He writes, "While we are in the process of erasing all vestiges of royalty, So again, this act of like getting rid of any signs of the old regime in France, any visual signs of the old regime. How is it that the impure remains of our kings continue to lay intact in the caves beneath the former Saint-Denis Abbey? We have helped ourselves to the effigy of all our despots. Not a single one was pardoned. Stone, marble, bronze, nothing was saved. Equestrian or pedestrian statues, busts, bas-reliefs, paintings, drawings, engravings, every image of the kings was removed from our view. And yet we put up with their relics, preciously conserved in lead tombs, and insulting to the memory of so many good citizens who died for the patrie and for liberty without ever receiving the honor of a burial. So what Prudhomme is referring to here is the royal necropolis of France, which occupied a medieval Gothic basilica in the city of Saint-Denis, just to the very north of Paris. Since the 10th century, the kings of France and their families had been buried at Saint-Denis, and the remains of earlier kings dating as far back as Clovis had been transported there in earlier centuries. So we have like 1,000 years of kings buried at Saint-Denis. So Prudhomme makes his call for the disinterment of the French kings at the beginning of 1793, right after Louis XVI is executed, right? And several months later, it starts to gain traction. There are radical revolutionaries kind of going rogue in Paris and sacking churches and digging up whoever's buried in those churches. But the state starts to get involved and take control of this in the summer of 1793. So let's remember, let's see, okay, so in the summer of 1793, the radical journalist and member of the legislature, this fellow named Bertrand Barrère, makes an appeal very similar to Prudhomme, so a couple months later. He announces that, quote, "The powerful hand of the Republic has a duty to mercilessly erase the royal epitaphs and demolish the mausoleums of the past." And so to amplify the significance of this act, Barrère suggests that this mass exhumation of the old kings of France take place on August 10th, 1793, which is significant to revolutionaries because it would have been the one-year anniversary of the insurrection that had overthrown the monarchy and led to the founding of the Republic. Okay? So again, it's this anniversary date. What better way to commemorate the dethronement and arrest of France's last king, Louis XVI, than by desecrating the remains of his predecessors? And ultimately, what he wants to do then is melt down fragments of these broken tombs to make cannonballs and bullets for the Republic. It's like kind of hard to overstate the symbolism, right? The significance of that. And the legislature immediately approves Barrère's recommendation, and they order the destruction of the royal tombs in honor of the founding of the Republic. So from August 6th to 8th, zealous Republicans disinter 51 tombs, dating from the 7th to the 15th centuries. And as revolutionaries, this is a painting depicting this, extracted the tombs from the ground, they took care to set aside anything of value, including jewels or precious metals. Lead coffins and adornments were dispatched to the National Foundry to be repurposed, perhaps into bullets, perhaps into other things. There's a whole other story of all the things that, anything of value is sent off to warehouses and sort of sent out where it's needed throughout the country. And I can talk more about that if you want later. It's really interesting, this kind of recycling project. The human remains, though, they're hastily buried in unmarked graves behind the church and covered in quicklime. So this is a very powerful act of desacralization, right? I mean, these are sacred bodies of the kings suddenly opened up and sort of, and not just touched by ordinary people, but torn from their tombs. Kind of anything is stripped off of them, and then they're kind of thrown without ceremony into these mass graves. And it continues a couple months later in October when the state dispatches a new delegation to finish the work that had been begun in August. And so for a couple of weeks in October, the remaining members of the French monarchy who were still buried in Saint-Denis, from Henri IV to Louis XV, were systematically, again, exhumed, examined, and discarded. And these monarchs suffer slightly further indignities than their predecessors had in August. For example, Henri IV, who was clothed in his funeral shroud, was removed from his coffin and publicly displayed in the lower chapel. at the cathedral at Saint Denis for 2 days, and people would come up and look at him. Someone cut off a bit of his mustache and pretended it was his own mustache, until he's finally thrown in the mass grave as well. Here's a drawing of Henri IV's mummified body. People are kind of really fascinated by this accidental mummification that happened. Eyewitness testimony from the exhumation described his corpse as perfectly preserved. His skull was still filled with 17th century aromatics that still smelled. They exuded this almost intolerably strong scent almost 200 years after his death. Louis XIV, the Sun King, Louis XIV's body was allegedly similarly well preserved, but somewhat ironically, the Sun King had turned this inky shade of black since his death. And when Louis XV's coffin was opened on October 16th, an eyewitness described how his skin was white, his nose was violet, and his buttocks were as pink as a newborn baby's. So again, a very powerful act of desacralization, right? That you would say this about the body of the king. And his body is then quickly thrown in the communal grave and covered with quicklime. So these acts of destruction have very obvious ties to the execution of the king and queen. The revolutionary government was very aware of this rapport. In fact, they'd arranged for this whole second round of exhumations to coincide with the execution of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, on October the 16th. So you can kind of imagine that Louis XV's body, the one I was just telling you about, that's sort of pink and white and violet, his body is disinterred on the same day, possibly even the same hour that his granddaughter-in-law is losing her head in Paris. And this is not a coincidence. Like, there are no coincidences when it comes to this kind of acts of symbolism in the French Revolution. So I've dwelt on this at some length because I think the emptying out of the royal tombs seems like a really important corollary to the creation of the Pantheon, right? They're kind of like opposites of one another. In one case, we have the destruction of the sacred fathers of the old regime, rendered sort of deeply unsacred by common Frenchmen. And on the other, we see the emergence of a new cult of the dead, emerging around heroes of the revolution. But before moving away from these royal ruins, I want to call your attention to one more striking thing that happens, as if there could be even more striking things that happen in this process of disinterment. So the royal disinterments are a pretty state-run affair. They're really organized, well documented, and somewhat orderly. There's notes taken on everything and these wonderful drawings that have been made. But they also have a more organic, popular dimension. As one of the eyewitnesses to the exhumations recorded, the local population of Saint Denis had been doing a little bit of their own excavation and reconstruction during this whole phenomena. They'd collected pieces of broken tombs and fragments of sculpture left over from the deconstruction of the royal necropolis, and they had remade them into a kind of patriotic altar that featured two large busts of two of the most significant and well-known dead revolutionaries of 1793, Michel Pelletier and Jean-Paul Marat, and I'll get into this in a moment. The eyewitness described how decorative marble was repurposed into ceiling vaults, while bits of royal sculpture were repurposed as pediments to this, what he called a bizarre monument to liberty. And unfortunately, there are no sketches or paintings of this structure, but it certainly testifies once again to the power of the dead during the French Revolution, and perhaps more significantly, the displacement of France's dead fathers by this new revolutionary brotherhood. And it's also worth mentioning that by the time these disinterments took place, Le Pelletier, one of these guys who's featured on this weird altar, is already in the Pantheon, and Jean-Paul Marat would join him a year later. Here are their images. So let's look very briefly at these two individuals who joined Mirabeau in the Pantheon. So the first of these is Louis Michel Le Pelletier. Now, he had been assassinated earlier in 1793 in January by a royalist in a Paris cafe after he voted for the king's death, sort of as punishment for voting for the king's death. And the second is much more famous and well known to anyone who's studied the revolution in any way, Jean-Paul Marat. Sort of radical, rabble-rousing, and very, very popular journalist. And now he had famously been assassinated, as probably many people know, in a bathtub, right, by a young woman, Charlotte Corday, a moderate revolutionary, who thought she was doing the good work of the revolution by ridding it of one of its most dangerous men. And both of these men became known immediately in Paris and France as great martyrs to the revolutionary cause. They're called the Martyrs of Liberty. And they're very, very quickly converted into national heroes, both by spontaneous and organized state action. And both of them enjoyed elaborate and somewhat unusual state funerals, very, very different from what happened with Mirabeau. This is 1793, sort of a very different time than 1791. Their funerals were planned and directed by the most famous artist of the Revolutionary era, Jacques-Louis David. And so for both of their funeral processions, their corpses were carried through Paris. They weren't concealed in a coffin like Mirabeau's had been. They were uncovered with their wounds on display for public viewing. These were quite literally the embodiment of the revolution, right? They're supposed to represent the revolution, the nation besieged by its enemies. And their wounds are the terrifying manifestation of the patrie en danger, right? The fatherland in danger. For Michel Le Pelletier, David had a pedestal constructed at the Place Vendôme. So this temporary pedestal that's constructed to hold the corpse of Le Pelletier. And you can kind of make it out, right? You can see he's sort of wrapped in a shroud and his naked torso is showing where he's been wounded. And this is at the base of constructed on the base of a destroyed statue of Louis XIV, of Louis XIV. So again, this very symbolic kind of reinscription of space, of replacing kind of a bad father or a bad great-grandfather with a martyred brother. In his eulogy of Le Pelletier, Bertrand Barrère ended by proposing that everyone present at this funeral swear an oath, quote, on the body of Le Pelletier to extinguish all personal animosity and to reunite to save the country. His dead body was tasked with this very heavy burden of creating unity and consensus among an increasingly fractured revolutionary population. And after the ceremony, immediately after the ceremony, his body is brought to the Pantheon, where he becomes the third entombed body. And the celebrations surrounding Jean-Paul Marat in the summer of 1793 is even more elaborate and dramatic. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any images of it, but we can look at images of his body, dead face. So after Marat's death, he becomes, in the words of one of the leading historians of the revolution, quote, the subject of the most extensive cult organized around an individual political figure in France. David also orchestrated Marat's public funeral and had his body carried through the city on a Roman-style bier. And famously, during this funeral procession, as Marat is being paraded through the city, members of a radical women's revolutionary club throw flowers on his decomposing body. And they do this to collect the blood of Marat. We heard something about this on Monday as well in the English Civil War. And they said, quote, let the blood of Marat become the seed of intrepid Republicans, one of them cries out. And then her fellow club members join in, and they promise to, quote, people the earth with as many Marats as they can. Right? So this is so strange. For this brief moment, we see the slain brother, the self-proclaimed ami du peuple, the friend of the people, become in death this kind of metaphorical father, maybe, for the nation. It's sort of a brief period. That's one of the only instances where you see that, actually. And Marat finds his way into the Pantheon a year later, in September of 1794. He's actually voted into the Pantheon before that, but he doesn't actually get moved there until September. There's a lot going on. However, just as Marat is making his entrance into the Pantheon, like by the front doors, Mirabeau is on his way out, through the side or through the back. I don't have an image of that either. Because Mirabeau, as it turned out, may not have been the perfect embodiment of the revolution, as everyone had thought in 1791. In fact, throughout his tenure on the National Assembly in the legislature, leading right up to his death, he had been in regular and secret communication with the king and queen. Right? That's not very revolutionary. And scholars disagree about the nature of Mirabeau's relationship with the monarchy. I mean, was he a pragmatist, just trying to get stuff done, kind of a deal maker, or was he a traitor? Kind of just self-interested in selling himself to the highest bidder. I don't know, and honestly, in this context, I don't think it really matters. A pantheonized Mirabeau was never going to actually be an accurate portrayal of the man, right, with all his complexities and contradictions. In the spring of 1791, when he was moved to the Pantheon, he fulfilled a need for the early revolution. And that was useful at the time. But by 1794, he was no longer needed, no longer wanted, and no longer necessary. And so he's kind of booted out. And so the first person to be pantheonized was also the first person to be depantheonized. Similarly, the controversial figure of Jean-Paul Marat, this guy, is only in the Pantheon for a very, very short time because he's a very radical figure, very sort of divisive. He's officially de-pantheonized in February of 1795, so 5 months after he makes it in, he's sort of kicked out again. And shortly after this, there's a new law passed in France declaring that no one can go into the Pantheon, no one can be pantheonized until at least a decade after their death. Okay, so no more hasty decisions to put people in the Pantheon, which is quite a significant change since literally everyone who's been put in the Pantheon has been put in there like immediately following their death. This is undoubtedly because by 1795, the French Revolution has entered yet a third phase of its political life, a reactionary phase, reacting to the excesses and violence of the terror. It's still a republic, but there's a third constitution that's written, a much more moderate and cautious constitution, the Constitution of 1795, which creates for the first time a bicameral legislature and dramatically curtails public rights in France. It's thus, I think, unsurprising that in this period of reaction, there's this law prohibiting hasty pantheonizations. Okay, so I don't really want to leave us on this kind of desolate note, which seems to imply that everything, as I've already said, kind of results to nothing and falls apart by 1795. I don't actually think that's the case. The Pantheon persists. It's there today. It continues to, like, most of the people in the Pantheon, I think, were entered in the Pantheon under the Napoleonic period, where it sort of enters a new phase, military heroes. But it's never really looms as large in political culture as it did during the Revolution. Instead, I think the place we need to look for the continued power and significance of the dead in France as kind of founders is not in the hallowed halls of its temples, but rather in the green spaces of its cemeteries. Kind of a radical shift here. Because in the aftermath of this revolutionary cult of the dead, there was this much quieter revolution in personal individual burial practices that's happening. And I actually have a whole book coming out about this in the spring. But the basic transformation that takes place is that ordinary people in Paris go from being buried in communal, semi-anonymous church graves to being buried in these individual graves with individual tombstones. It's this kind of massive revolution in the way people think about and commemorate and visit their dead. And we can, if you want, we can talk about that. It's a whole separate issue. But the first and most extreme example of this is the cemetery of Père-Lachaise. And if you've been to Paris, you've undoubtedly seen this cemetery. It's very famous for like a lot of the celebrities who are buried there. Both sort of medieval celebrities like Abelard and Eloise, but also 20th century and 19th century celebrities. Oscar Wilde is buried there, and Jim Morrison was like very famous for being buried there, right? But it's opened in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution in 1804. And it acts as the model. It's open to great acclaim because it's the first like pastoral suburban cemetery, right? This is not like a gloomy churchyard. This is a green space you would go to visit. Even if you didn't have someone necessarily to visit there, you'd go to the cemetery. And you would see other French people, both dead and living. You read the tombstones, and the tombstones in the 19th century are, these early tombstones and the first tombstones at Père-Lachaise are really interesting because they're super detailed. This is one of my favorite ones of a Napoleonic soldier who dies in Central Europe. And it has all the details of his death, including like his last words, which apparently were, "My mother, my poor mother." His mother has written this epitaph for herself and also depicted like a crying woman at the base of the monument. And a lot of these are covered kind of on every side with information about an individual's life. And so you would walk through the cemetery and read the lives of these ordinary people. I mean, he's a soldier, so he's not necessarily just a nobody. And this becomes a very famous tombstone to visit, actually. But a lot of these are kind of just ordinary people who you would never have a reason to know about otherwise. And people read about sort of their everyday virtuous acts, right? You're a good father, a good mother, a devoted son. You've left all of these sad people in your wake. And in doing so, you kind of connect emotionally with all these people you would never otherwise meet. And it's this interesting new kind of cult of the dead, right? Not a cult of great men, not a cult of founding fathers, but the cult of the ordinary dead, rendered memorable and inspiring to their family and to their strangers for their small acts of dedication to the patrie, to their fellow citizens, and to their families. And this is actually the tomb of Michelet, so we'll end with Michelet just as we started with him. He's buried here with his son and his wife, and this becomes kind of this national monument for people to visit in Père-Lachaise. So that's, I think, where I'm going to end.
Thank you very much.